Now let's start with today's story. Name's Brian. I'm 32, been a mechanic for the past 10 years. Started right after finishing tech school, but I was under the hood long before that. My uncle had a garage, and I spent most of my teenage years learning from him. By the time I got my certifications, fixing cars wasn't just a job, it was what I loved. Cars ain't just engines and metal anymore. They're computers on wheels, and you gotta know your stuff if you want to stay ahead. It's honest work, pays the bills, and at the end of the day, I get to go home knowing I actually built or fixed something with my own hands. I met Sarah, well, let's just call her that, about 7 years ago. She walked into the shop needing a repair, and looking back, I should have noticed the signs from the start. "This is a premium car," she said, crossing her arms like she was laying down some law. "I don't want just anyone working on it." I wiped my hands on a rag and gave her a nod. "Yeah, don't worry. We know how to handle premium." She looked at me, a little skeptical, but when I walked her through the issue and explained exactly how we'd fix it, she smiled. That smile, man, that was enough to make me forget she'd been acting all high and mighty just moments before. She worked in marketing, downtown, always dressed sharp, carrying these designer bags that I couldn't even pronounce. At first, I couldn't believe someone like her was giving me the time of day. I'd go home covered in grease, and here she was, looking like she walked out of a high-end catalog. But she seemed interested in what I did, asked me questions about cars, sometimes even brought me lunch at the shop. The guys there would joke around, asking me how I managed to pull someone so classy. "She got a sister?" Mike, my coworker, had teased one day when Sarah dropped off a burger and fries for me. I chuckled. "Nah, man, just lucky, I guess." At least, that's what I thought. Sarah used to tell me how much she admired my work ethic, how she loved that I followed my passion. That meant something to me. So, when we hit the 2-year mark, I asked her to marry me. We had a decent wedding, not too fancy, but nice. Her parents put in most of the money, though I pitched in what I could. Her dad, some big-time real estate developer, acted like he respected me, even co-signed the loan for my house. But I never took a cent from him. See, I'd been saving for years, living in this tiny apartment, putting away every extra dollar from side jobs. When I finally bought the house, 3 bedrooms, 2 baths, nice yard, good neighborhood, I felt proud. I worked my ass off for it. At first, Sarah seemed excited, said we'd fix it up together, make it our own. But then the comments started. One day, she had some coworkers over. I was grabbing beers from the fridge when I heard her talking in the living room. "We're planning to move to a better neighborhood soon," she said, her voice casual but pointed. "This is just our starter home." I froze for a second, letting that sink in. My stomach tightened, and for the first time, I realized what I'd worked so hard for wasn't good enough for her. And that was just the beginning. I started noticing things, how she hesitated before telling people what I did for a living at her office parties. When she'd actually bring me, she'd introduce me as a small business owner in the automotive industry. I mean, technically, that turned out to be true later, but back then, it felt like she was embarrassed to just say I was a mechanic. My sister Jenny saw through Sarah from the beginning. She'd come by the shop sometimes to have her car checked out, and she told me once, "I don't trust the way she looks at you, like you're some project she's working on." I brushed it off. "Come on, Jenny, you're just being overprotective." "She's not like that." Jenny just shook her head. "I'm telling you, Brian, just watch out." The first year of marriage was okay, I guess. We had our routines. I'd work at the shop from 7 to 6 o'clock, sometimes later if we had a complicated job. Sarah worked 9 to 5 o'clock, but usually stayed late for client meetings or team-building events. I should have paid more attention to those late nights, but I was busy taking business classes at the community college. Didn't tell her about those because she always made fun of any suggestion I had about improve myself that didn't involve leaving the auto shop. Looking back now, I can see all the warning signs. The way she'd wrinkle her nose when I came home with grease stains on my clothes, how she stopped hanging out in the garage when I was working on my project car, the constant suggestions about going back to school to get a real career. But you know what they say about hindsight and all that. Things really started going sideways about 2 years into our marriage. Sarah got promoted at her marketing firm, and that's when she became absolutely unbearable. She'd come home talking about these fancy client dinners and office events, always mentioning this guy Mark who helped her so much with the promotion. I remember this one night specifically. She came home super late, like 11 p.m., wearing this new dress I'd never seen before. "Where'd you get that?" I asked, trying to keep my voice casual. "Oh, the office had an emergency client meeting," she said, brushing past me. I had to go shopping for appropriate clothes. I frowned. "You had to buy a whole new dress for a meeting?" She sighed, exasperated. "Brian, It's just work. I don't have time for this. Made me feel like an idiot for even asking. That's around the time she started making these weird comments about the house. My father-in-law, remember, he co-signed the loan, would come over for dinner, and they'd talk about property values and how I was holding Sarah back by not wanting to move to a fancier neighborhood. Right in front of me at our dinner table, he'd go on about how his signature on the loan meant he had some say in what happened to the place. And Sarah? She'd just sit there, nodding along. The worst part was how she started treating my job. One time, this rich client brought in his Ferrari for repairs. Most shops in town wouldn't touch it, but I've got certifications for luxury cars. Sarah actually told her friends I was playing around with expensive toys instead of focusing on a real career. Meanwhile, I was making bank on these specialty repairs, but she never bothered to ask about that part. I used to laugh it off, but then it started to bother me. Then came the work parties. Man, those were rough. There was this one event, some fancy Christmas party at this expensive hotel downtown. I spent good money on a nice suit, so I'd fit in with her crowd. The whole night, she kept leaving me alone while she hung out with her work friends. Her office crowd was something else. All these guys in expensive suits talking about their investment portfolios and vacation homes. One dude actually asked me if I knew any reliable mechanics right after Sarah introduced me as her husband. "You're a mechanic?" he said, eyebrows raised. "Hey, I've been looking for someone reliable. Got any recommendations?" Sarah just laughed it off, patting my arm like I was some kind of charity case. I stood there feeling like a complete outsider. The distance between us only grew after that party. We used to at least eat dinner together most nights, but now she was working late more and more. When she was home, she seemed distracted, always checking her phone or laptop. One evening, I tried to set up a date night. "Hey, how about we go to that steakhouse we used to love this Saturday? Just the two of us." She barely looked up from her phone. "I can't, Brian. There's a big client coming into town, and we have dinner plans. It's important. More important than spending time with your husband?" She sighed, rolling her eyes. "You just don't get it. This is my career, Brian. I can't just drop everything for a date night." I started noticing she was texting constantly, always keeping her phone face down, walking out of rooms to take calls. Classic stuff, right? But I kept telling myself I was just being paranoid. I mean, she was a marketing executive now, obviously. She'd have lots of work calls. The real problem started when her brother got involved. This guy was always a piece of work. He brought his car to my shop once and expected me to fix it for free because we were family. "Come on, man," he said, leaning against the counter. "We're family. It's just a small favor." "A small favor? You need new brakes, an oil change, and a full inspection." "That's not small." He scoffed. "Unbelievable. I'll tell Sarah about this. She's going to be pissed." Sure enough, later that night, Sarah came home fuming. "Why couldn't you just help my brother out? It's not like you're doing brain surgery, Brian. It's just car repairs." I clenched my jaw. "I work hard for my money, Sarah. Just because I'm a mechanic doesn't mean I should give out free labor. Would your marketing firm work for free?" She just huffed and walked away. My father-in-law got worse too. Started showing up at my shop unannounced, asking about my finances, wanting to see paperwork for the house payments. "You know, Brian," he said one afternoon, tapping his fingers on my desk, "I co-signed that loan. I need to make sure my investment is secure." I leaned back, crossing my arms. "I've never missed a payment. Never will. My finances are none of your business." He narrowed his eyes. "As long as my name is on that paperwork, it is my business." I was working late most nights, partly to avoid going home to another argument about my lack of ambition and partly because of these business classes I was taking. Sarah never asked why I was late. Probably thought I was just working on cars. She'd make these snide comments about how I chose Greece over her. The breaking point came during one of her company's summer parties. They rented out this fancy rooftop bar, and Sarah insisted I come. "It'll make up for you missing the last few office events," she said. Funny thing was, I hadn't actually missed any. She just told people I wasn't there. I walked in and saw her standing super close to this tall guy in an expensive suit. The way they jumped apart when they saw me, well, let's just say I'm not as dumb as Sarah thought I was. I confronted her later that night. "Who was that guy? Mark, right? You two looked real cozy." She rolled her eyes. "Oh, don't start, Brian. He's just a coworker. We were talking about work." "Talking about work doesn't usually involve standing that close," I shot back. She sighed. "You're being ridiculous." I knew something was wrong, but I didn't have proof yet. I started paying attention to patterns. Every Thursday, she'd stay late at the office, but her car wouldn't be in the office parking lot when I drove by. Then there were the credit card statements. Suddenly, there were all these charges from restaurants I'd never heard of. Always for 2 people. Always on Thursdays. One night, I held up the statement. Sarah, what's this? A dinner for 2 at some fancy steakhouse downtown? On a Thursday? She snatched the paper from my hand. It's a client meeting, Brian. I told you, I have these all the time. Funny how these client meetings always happen at romantic restaurants downtown. I still remember the day I checked the mail and found that envelope from the jewelry store. One of those fancy places downtown where everything costs more than my first car. My first thought was that maybe Sarah had finally decided to surprise me with something nice. But then I saw the receipt. A men's watch. And not just any watch, but the kind of overpriced luxury piece that screamed status. My birthday wasn't anywhere close, and Sarah had never bought me jewelry before. She always said, "What's the point? You're just going to get oil and grease all over it. So why now? And why a watch?" That night, I sat at the kitchen table, the envelope in front of me, waiting for her to come home. When she finally walked in around 9:30, dressed way too nice for someone who was supposedly working late, I held up the receipt. "Hey, got the mail today. Want to tell me about this?" I asked, keeping my voice steady. She glanced at the paper, then back at me, her expression unreadable. "Oh, that? It's a gift." "A gift?" I repeated. "For who?" "For my boss," she said, way too quickly. "It's a thank you gift. He, helped me a lot with the promotion." I just stared at her. "You bought a men's watch from a high-end jewelry store as a thank you gift? That's interesting." She let out a sharp laugh and shook her head. "Jesus, Brian, are you really doing this? You sound ridiculous." "I sound ridiculous?" I let out a breath, trying to keep my anger in check. "Sarah, I've been trying to talk to you for weeks now, trying to understand why you've been acting different, staying late, dodging my questions. And every time, you make me feel like I'm crazy. But now I find a damn jewelry receipt for a gift that sure as hell ain't for me, and I'm the one who sounds ridiculous?" She rolled her eyes and crossed her arms. "You're being insecure and controlling. It's exhausting, Brian. Just because I have a career and work late doesn't mean I'm doing something shady." I leaned forward, pressing my palms against the table. "Then tell me the truth. Because none of this adds up." Her face hardened. "You know what? I don't have to justify every little thing I do to you. I work my ass off, and all I get when I come home is an interrogation." I shook my head, laughing bitterly. "Funny. I thought marriage meant being honest with each other." She grabbed the receipt off the table, crumpling it in her fist. "I can't deal with this right now." And with that, she turned on her heel and walked out of the kitchen. The more I pushed, the more she pulled away. It was like every time I asked a question, I was the problem. She started making little digs, saying I was obsessive, paranoid. Every time I caught something that didn't make sense, she twisted it back on me until I started questioning myself. Then came the final straw, Amy. Amy was a girl from Sarah's office who came into my shop one afternoon for an oil change. She was one of those chatty customers, the kind that talks your ear off while you work. Halfway through, she looked at me, tilting her head like she was confused. "Oh, I thought you guys split up already," she said casually, like she was commenting on the weather. I froze, tightening my grip on the wrench. "Excuse me?" She blinked. "Sarah, she said you two were separated, that you weren't living together anymore." I set my tools down, my heartbeat hammering in my ears. "She told people that?" Amy's face went pale. "Oh, I thought you knew?" I forced a smile. "No, Amy, I didn't know." She shifted uncomfortably. "Look, I don't want to get involved, but everyone in the office knows about her and Mark." There it was. The truth. No more guessing, no more paranoia. Just cold, hard reality hitting me like a freight train. "Her and Mark," I echoed, my voice hollow. Amy nodded slowly. "They go out for lunch all the time. Fancy places, you know? They're not exactly hiding it." Not hiding it. I felt like an idiot. I'd been coming home every night, cooking dinner, paying the bills, thinking we were just in a rough patch. Meanwhile, she was telling people we were already over. That night, I sat in my truck outside our house, gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. I went over every memory, every late night, every unanswered text. It all made sense now. The worst part wasn't even the betrayal. It was how much effort she put into making me look like the clueless idiot who couldn't see what was right in front of him. That's when I knew I couldn't let her walk all over me. I wasn't going to just roll over and let her paint me as some dumb mechanic who didn't see this coming. I needed proof. I called up my buddy, who's a cop, and told him everything. He didn't even hesitate. "All right, man, let's get you some evidence." We set up a system. documenting dates, times, receipts. I started tracking her location, keeping records of every suspicious charge. And then, one night, I found the final nail in the coffin. I was going through our credit card statements, matching them up with my notes, when I saw it. Charges from a fancy hotel downtown. Weekend marketing conferences, she'd said, but I had the receipts to prove otherwise. I sat across from Sarah at the kitchen table, my hands gripping the edge just enough to keep from shaking. She barely looked up from her phone, scrolling through whatever urgent business occupied her time more than our marriage. "Hey, Sarah, I noticed something weird with our joint savings account today," I said, keeping my voice level. She didn't even flinch, just let out a little sigh before setting her phone down, her expression carefully neutral. "Oh? What do you mean?" "I mean that there's barely anything left in it." I leaned forward slightly. Looked like someone made a pretty big transfer. She tilted her head, giving me that patronizing smile that made my blood pressure spike. "Brian, I told you I was investing in my future." "Investing?" I let out a dry laugh. "That's what you're calling it?" "Because from where I'm sitting, it looks a hell of a lot like you just drained our savings without even talking to me." She shrugged, like we were discussing a minor inconvenience, like I wasn't standing in the wreckage of our life together. "I make more money, Brian. It only makes sense that I take control of our finances. I mean, let's be real. How much were you even contributing to that account?" Her voice was honeyed, soft, like she was doing me a favor by laying out just how little she thought of me. I clenched my jaw, enough that I should have a say in what happens to it. She waved a dismissive hand. "It's not like I took everything. There's still enough for the bills. Don't be dramatic." "Dramatic?" I echoed, laughing bitterly. "Sarah, you didn't just take money. You took our future." Her phone buzzed, and she glanced at it before standing up, already done with this conversation. "I don't have time for this right now. We can talk about it later, okay?" She grabbed her purse and was out the door before I could say another word. Later never came. Meeting with the lawyer was like stepping into a world where, for once, I wasn't the one being played. He flipped through the stack of evidence I'd gathered, nodding in approval as he read through the credit card statements, the location logs, the hotel receipts. When he got to the screenshots of the messages between Sarah and Mark, his mouth twisted into something like satisfaction. "This is good," he said, setting the papers down. "You've done most of the work already. Given the state laws, we can make sure this works in your favor. But listen, Brian, until we're ready to file, you need to keep everything business as usual. Act normal." I leaned back in my chair, rubbing a hand over my face. "You're telling me I have to sit across from her at the dinner table, knowing she's with him? That I have to pretend I don't know she's planning a life without me?" "Exactly." His voice was firm. "If she gets even a whiff that you're onto her, she'll try to hide assets, spin things in her favor. Right now, she thinks she's in control. Use that." So, I did. For 2 weeks, I played the role of the oblivious husband. Every morning, I kissed Sarah goodbye as she left for work, pretending not to notice how quickly she grabbed her phone when she thought I wasn't looking. Every night, I let her lie to my face about client meetings while I counted down the days until I could walk away from this mess with my dignity intact. Then came the dinner with her parents. We were at their house, sitting around their oversized dining table, eating a meal that tasted like cardboard because I could barely focus on anything but keeping my expression neutral. Sarah's father, always the businessman, took a sip of his whiskey before clearing his throat and leaning forward. "Brian, we've been talking, and we think it'd be best if you signed over part of the house to Sarah," he said, his voice the picture of calm authority. I set my fork down slowly, my stomach turning to ice. "For what reason exactly?" Sarah's mother gave me a sympathetic look, the kind reserved for people who were too slow to understand what was best for them. "For security purposes, dear. Just in case." I looked at Sarah, who wouldn't meet my eyes. They weren't just planning for a separation. They were planning to push me out completely. The lawyer suggested I get proof of her father's demands about the house, so I started recording our conversations. Legal in my state with one-party consent. Got some pretty interesting stuff. Him literally saying, while joking, that he'd make my life difficult if I didn't give Sarah what she wanted. Then came the day everything exploded. It was a regular Thursday, Sarah's usual late meeting night. I was at the shop finishing up when my neighbor, Mr. Hayes, called. "I thought you should know, Sarah just pulled up with some man I've never seen before." They went inside together. I knew exactly who it was. My hands were steady when I drove home. Strange how calm you can be when you finally have to face something you've known was coming. I walked in to find them in the kitchen, Sarah and Mark. His hands were on her waist. The look on her face when she saw me standing there? I'll never forget it. "Get out," I said quietly. Both of you. Now. Sarah's face went from shock to angry in a second. This is my house too. You can't just. The house that I paid for. I cut her off, still using that eerie calm voice. That seemed to make her even angrier. You have 30 minutes to pack a bag and leave. Mark, the coward, slipped out without a word while Sarah was still screaming at me about her rights. 20 minutes later, she was on the phone with her father, yelling for backup. Her dad's SUV came screeching into the driveway, her brother Tommy jumping out before it even stopped. You can't throw my daughter out, her father bellowed, trying to push past me into the house. Tommy was puffing up beside him, ready for a fight. I held up my phone, already recording. You're both trespassing. I've already called the police. They're on their way. This is my daughter's home. I co-signed the loan. This house is mine, he shouted, waving a folder of papers in my face, but I could see the uncertainty in his eyes. Your daughter's been cheating on me for months, I said loud enough for the gathering neighbors to hear. I have proof of everything, the hotel receipts, the messages. You really want to do this here? In public? That's when the cops showed up. Guess Sarah's family forgot I had the local PD's number on speed dial after fixing half their fleet. Tommy made one last grab for the door, but stopped cold when he saw the officers walking up. Funny how quickly someone's attitude changes when they realize they're about to catch a breaking and entering charge. The next hour was surprisingly quiet. Sarah packed her bags while the police supervised. Her father and brother stood by their car, looking less confident by the minute. As she walked out, Sarah tried one last time. You'll regret this. You have no idea what you're doing. I just smiled. Actually, for the first time in a long while, I know exactly what I'm doing. The next day, my lawyer filed for divorce. Sarah got served papers at her office. Found out later she made a big scene about it, crying to her coworkers about how cruel I was. Meanwhile, she'd been planning to take half my assets and move in with Mark the whole time. Her lawyer contacted mine, trying to negotiate before things got messy. They offered to let me keep the house if I paid Sarah a huge settlement. The amount they wanted was insane, like they thought I was hiding money somewhere. My lawyer told them to pound sand. That weekend was wild. Sarah's family started telling everyone who would listen that I was abusive, that I trapped her in a bad marriage, that I was trying to leave her homeless. Some of her friends even posted about me on social media. My sister wanted to respond, but I told her to let them dig their own grave. Sarah tried coming back to the house to get more stuff, but I'd changed the locks. My lawyer said she needed to go through proper channels now. She left this long voicemail about how I was being petty and immature. Pretty rich coming from someone who got caught going through my house with her boyfriend. The next few weeks were a paperwork circus. Their lawyer kept sending these demanding letters, acting like Sarah was entitled to everything because her dad's name was on the loan. They really thought they had me cornered. Even sent this detailed list of everything they wanted. The house, half my savings, my project car, even my tools, like they were shopping from a catalog or something. The first court date was just a preliminary hearing, but Sarah and her crowd treated it like they'd already won. She showed up with her parents, Mark, and this expensive-looking lawyer who looked like he just walked off a TV show. They were all sitting together, whispering and pointing at me like I was some kind of joke. My lawyer told me to wear my work clothes. Not my greasy ones, but my clean shop uniform with my name and certifications on it. Said it would help show I was a working professional, not some lazy bum like they were trying to paint me. Sarah actually laughed when she saw me. He couldn't even dress properly for court, she said to Mark, loud enough for everyone to hear. I ignored her. Let her feel confident. When Sarah's lawyer started talking about how she supported my career and helped build the business, I thought I was going to lose it. They tried claiming she did the books for the shop, which was completely false. She'd never even looked at my business paperwork. Then they brought up the house. Sarah's dad got up and testified about how he co-signed the loan because I wasn't financially stable enough to get approved on my own. Made it sound like he was doing charity work. My lawyer just sat there, taking notes, looking completely calm while they built this whole fake story. The real fun started when they mentioned Mark. He tried to act like he was just a work friend helping Sarah through a rough time. The whole courtroom must have felt my eyes burning a hole through him. Meanwhile, my lawyer calmly pulled out a thick folder and placed it on the table, flipping it open for the judge to see. Your Honor, my lawyer said, here are copies of text messages between Sarah and Mark, detailing their affair. Additionally, we have hotel receipts and time-stamped photos of them together. On nights Sarah told my client she was away at work conferences. Sarah's mom gasped loudly, clutching at her pearls like we were in some kind of soap opera. Her dad clenched his jaw, his face turning red. Sarah, for the first time that day, looked nervous. Mark, though? He just smirked. Then Sarah's mom stood up and decided to put on a show. My daughter deserves a better life than being a mechanic's wife, she declared. Brian has held her back from her true potential, and if he had just signed the prenup we wanted, none of this would be happening. I couldn't help it, I laughed. Right, because I'm the one who ruined the marriage. Sarah shot me a glare. You never supported my dreams. Your dreams? I scoffed. Sarah, you were cheating on me while I was busting my ass to build a future for us. You weren't exactly out changing the world. Sarah huffed, crossing her arms like a petulant child. Meanwhile, Mark sat there looking smug. He even had the audacity to submit paperwork showing his salary and bonuses as if that proved he was a better man than me. My lawyer barely acknowledged it, just calmly adding the papers to our growing evidence pile. They had no idea what was coming. During the break, I stepped outside to get some air, and that's when I heard something that nearly made me see red. Mark and Sarah's brother, Tommy, were leaning against Sarah's dad's SUV, chatting like they were picking out furniture at a department store. I'm thinking we tear out that old garage workshop and make it a gym, Mark said. Gotta have a place to keep in shape. Tommy nodded. Yeah, and Dad's already getting quotes for some remodeling inside. We should knock out that ugly kitchen wall. Open concept, you know? I took a slow, deep breath, forcing myself to stay calm. They were planning renovations. On my house. Like it was already theirs. As if that wasn't enough, Sarah's lawyer later tried to argue that she had partial ownership of my tools. Sarah helped select these tools for the business, her lawyer claimed. My lawyer, barely hiding his amusement, leaned forward. Really? Then perhaps she can name one specific tool she helped pick out. Sarah hesitated. Well, I didn't pick them, but I supported the tool buying process. The judge raised an eyebrow at that. Then they twisted my night classes into a new accusation, claiming I neglected the marriage by going to school instead of spending time with Sarah. They conveniently left out that Sarah was spending those nights with Mark. By the end of the day, Sarah's lawyer presented their demands. We request that the house be signed over to Sarah, the lawyer stated. Her father co-signed the loan, making it partially his. Additionally, she is entitled to half of Mr. Miller's business assets. I nearly choked. Half of my business assets? As well as the project car, as she has endured years of it taking up space in the garage. She deserves proper compensation. I clenched my jaw. Endured? That car was my pride and joy. It was the one thing I worked on when I needed to clear my head. And now they wanted to take it, too? The judge set another court date for the following week. As I was walking out, Sarah's dad tried to corner me in the parking lot. Look, Brian, let's be reasonable here, he said, his voice low and slimy. We can make this all go away if you just sign over what we're asking. No need to drag this out. My lawyer, standing right beside me, lifted his phone. You're being recorded. Sarah's dad went stiff, then forced out a fake chuckle. Just trying to settle things amicably. I shook my head and walked away. The week leading up to the next court date was hell. I barely slept, the stress eating away at me. Every night, I'd go down to my workshop, running my hands over my tools, wondering if it would all be taken from me. My family tried to keep my spirits up, but they could tell I was a wreck. But Sarah and her family didn't realize one thing. Every lie they told, every smear they spread, and every underhanded move they pulled. It only made me more determined to see this through to the end. When the second court date finally arrived, I felt like I was walking into the ring for the fight of my life. My hands clenched at my sides as I stepped into the courtroom, my lawyer giving me a reassuring nod. Across the aisle, Sarah and her entourage sat smugly, as if they had already won. Sarah's team paraded their witnesses up one by one. First, some so-called expert who magically inflated my shop's value without ever stepping foot in it. Then Mark took the stand, spinning this sob story about how Sarah struggled emotionally with my blue-collar status, making it sound like I was some loser dragging her down. The cherry on top was Sarah's dad, rewriting history about his role in our marriage, acting like he had been my financial savior. The whole time, my lawyer just kept taking notes with this knowing smile. I sat there, thinking about how none of them had any idea what was coming next. Then it was our turn. My lawyer stood up and called our first witness, my old boss from the shop. Sarah's side looked confused, probably thinking he was just going to talk about my work ethic. Instead, he pulled out a contract from 6 months ago. As you can see, Your Honor, my lawyer said, holding up the document, when Mr. Henderson here was preparing to retire, he didn't just hire a manager to replace him. He sold the entire business to Brian Miller. Silence. Then a murmur ran through the courtroom. Sarah's side looked like they'd just been hit with a sledgehammer. Mark's smug grin disappeared really quick. Sarah's dad stopped his constant whispering to her lawyer, and Sarah, she went completely pale. My lawyer continued, Mr. Miller has been the sole owner of the shop for 6 months, though he continued to work regular shifts because he enjoys the work. He laid out the documentation. Business classes I'd been taking for 2 years to prepare for ownership. The loan I got approved for, without any co-signers. The shop's financial records. The business is thriving, Your Honor. Better than they assumed. Mr. Miller has secured contracts with 3 luxury car dealerships, a fleet maintenance deal with a major company, and is in the process of opening a second location. Sarah's face twisted with shock. She bolted up from her seat. This is a lie. I was married to him when he bought it. I should get half. That's when my lawyer calmly pulled out the purchase agreement. Your Honor, this sale was finalized 2 weeks before Mr. Miller discovered the affair. He turned to Sarah, paid for entirely with his own savings and a business loan in his name alone. The judge raised an eyebrow and looked at Sarah. Mrs. Miller, if you were so involved in the business as you claim, why did you have no knowledge of this sale? Sarah's lawyer fumbled, trying to come up with an explanation, but my lawyer was already flipping to the next page. In fact, Your Honor, we have evidence that on the day Mr. Miller signed the purchase papers, Mrs. Miller was out of town, at a hotel with Mr. Mark Dawson. Sarah's dad lurched forward. What about the house? He barked. I co-signed the loan. He wouldn't even have it without me. My lawyer didn't even blink. Actually, Mr. Miller refinanced the house 2 months ago, without a co-signer. His business income made that possible. The color drained from Sarah's dad's face. During the court break, chaos erupted in the hallway. Sarah's voice rang out, shrill and furious. You should have investigated his finances better. She screamed at her lawyer, her face twisted in rage. When we walked back into the courtroom, Sarah's whole demeanor had shifted. Gone was the arrogance, the smug entitlement. Instead, she was crying, big, dramatic tears, the kind meant to sway sympathy. She sniffled, dabbing at her eyes as she looked at the judge with this wounded expression. Your Honor, she began, her voice trembling, I always believed in Brian's dreams. I supported him every step of the way. I gave up better job opportunities to stay here and help him build his business. I scoffed under my breath. What business did she help build? The only thing she ever built was a stack of hotel receipts with Mark. The judge looked thoroughly unimpressed. Go on, he said, his tone flat. Sarah's lawyer took over, trying a new angle. Your Honor, emotional support is often overlooked in cases like this. My client's encouragement and sacrifices directly contributed to the growth of Brian's business. Given this, we request that she receive a fair percentage of the shop's value as compensation for her contributions. My lawyer simply smiled and leaned forward. With all due respect, Your Honor, we anticipated this claim. He pulled out a USB drive and handed it to the bailiff. Exhibit C. A moment later, Sarah's own voice filled the courtroom. Ugh, I hate the smell of his shop. I swear. I come home and I still feel like I'm covered in grease. The recording continued. Mark, you don't understand. It's embarrassing. He's just a grease monkey. When I think about what my life could have been, well, let's just say I settled. A stunned silence filled the room. Sarah's tears stopped instantly, her face frozen in horror. Mark, who had been sitting quietly, suddenly looked very interested in the floor. The judge rubbed his temples. Mrs. Miller, is that your voice in the recording? Sarah shifted in her seat. I was venting. It wasn't. The judge held up a hand. I've heard enough. He turned toward her lawyer, who looked just as pale as his client. Any further arguments? Before he could answer, there was a commotion at the back of the courtroom. A man in a sharp suit walked in, his steps brisk, his expression tight. He whispered something to Mark, who immediately sat up straighter. Your Honor, the new guy said, stepping forward. My name is Richard Lawson, representing Mark Dawson. My client wishes to make it clear that he had no knowledge of the complexity of this situation and wants to distance himself from any financial discussions. The entire courtroom went dead silent. Sarah turned to Mark, her eyes wide with shock. What? She whispered. Mark cleared his throat and didn't look at her. It's best if we just leave it alone. Sarah looked like she'd been physically slapped. You said you'd take care of me. She hissed, her voice barely above a whisper. Mark finally met her gaze, but there was no affection there. No loyalty. Just calculation. That was before I found out you weren't getting anything. Sarah opened her mouth, but no words came out. She just stared at him, betrayed and furious. Meanwhile, I sat back, arms crossed, enjoying the best entertainment I'd had in years. The judge sighed, clearly over it. All right, let's wrap this up. The final ruling was everything I had hoped for. Sarah got nothing from the business. No percentage, no stake, nothing. The judge was clear. She had no claim to something she didn't even know existed. The house? Mine, free and clear. Turns out refinancing it when I did was the best decision I ever made. She got to keep her car, which was in her name anyway, and a small amount of support for 3 months to transition. That was it. No big payout. No luxury lifestyle. No dream home makeover. Sarah lost it. This isn't fair, she shrieked, her carefully crafted image of a supportive wife falling apart. I wasted years with him. The judge looked unimpressed. Mrs. Miller, if you don't compose yourself, I will hold you in contempt. Her mother had to practically drag her out of the courtroom while her father stood frozen in place, his face red with rage. The moment they were out the door, he turned to his lawyer. You should have hired a private investigator, he hissed, his voice barely contained. How the hell did you miss this? My lawyer, still recording, just gave me a knowing look. That might come in handy later, he murmured. And just like that, it was over. The aftermath was even better than I could have hoped. Sarah's dad tried to spread rumors about me in the business community, but it backfired spectacularly. Turns out, the other shop owners already knew I had bought the place. We worked together in the local business association, and some of them even started sending their luxury car clients my way just to rub it in. People loved the fact that the owner still worked on cars himself. My shop's reputation skyrocketed. More high-end clients came in, wanting a real mechanic who actually knew what he was doing, not just some businessman who bought a garage. And then there was Mark. He thought he had gotten away, disappearing the moment he realized Sarah wasn't getting any money. But karma? It doesn't forget. Turns out, his company had strict policies about workplace relationships. And someone, definitely not me, sent their HR department the court documents showing he was involved with Sarah while she was still married. Mark got what was coming to him. The company found out about his little office romance with Sarah, and their strict policies meant there were consequences. He got demoted and shipped off to some tiny branch 3 states away. No corner office, no cushy setup, just a desk in a place where no one cared who he was. Sarah didn't fare much better. She tried to hold on to her job, but the whole mess had tainted her reputation. That big client she and Mark had been handling? They specifically requested a new team after the scandal broke. Word spread, and pretty soon, she was nothing more than office gossip. She ended up quitting and, in a last-ditch effort, tried to sue the company for creating a hostile work environment. That went nowhere fast. Meanwhile, my shop was thriving. I finally opened the second location I had been planning for months. Hired some great mechanics, guys who actually appreciated the work and took pride in what they did. The best part? Sarah's dad, the same man who tried to take everything from me, went around telling people that he had mentored me, that he had played some great role in my success. Nobody bought it. Other business owners had seen the court documents where he tried to steal my house. His reputation took a massive hit. Turns out, people don't exactly trust a man who would screw over his own son-in-law. The same people he used to do business with stopped taking him seriously. I heard from a few shop owners in the local business association that he had to practically beg for contracts he used to get easily. And the house? The one Sarah fought so hard to take? Yeah, I just finished renovating it. Added a brand new garage, twice the size of the old one. It's everything I ever wanted. Sometimes, I catch Sarah driving by. She slows down just enough to stare, probably thinking about all the plans she had for the place. Guess reality finally hit her. Her brother? Still takes his car to other shops. Pays way more for worse service. I heard he even had to replace an entire transmission after getting screwed over by a shady mechanic. Could have just come to me, but pride's a funny thing. Then, last month, I got an email from Sarah. Long, drawn out, full of regret. She wrote about how she never meant to hurt me, how she wished she had done things differently. Said she realized Mark wasn't the man she thought he was, especially after he took that transfer without even telling her. She wanted to talk. I never responded. Jenny, my sister, keeps saying I should write a book about all of this. But honestly, I'm too busy living my life, running my shops, doing what I love. The best revenge isn't petty, it's success. I still wear my work uniform most days. Could wear a suit if I wanted to, but I don't see the point. I love what I do, and the mechanics respect me more because I'm right there with them, getting my hands dirty. Just last week, we landed another major contract. The clients came by to sign the papers, and I was under a car doing an inspection when they arrived. They actually said they respected that I was still hands-on, unlike some shop owners who just sit behind a desk. Funny thing, some of Sarah's friends, the same ones who used to mock my job, now come to my shop. They act like they never said a bad word about me, trying to get special treatment. I just smile and treat them like any other customer. No need for revenge when success speaks for itself. And no, before anyone asks, I'm still single. And no, I'm not looking. Too busy enjoying my drama-free life and growing my business.